Alrighty, so take a little bit of time to wrap your head around the alternation of generations. We will talk about how it's very obvious in the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. It's less obvious in the ferns. And then when we get to the conifers and the flowering plants, it's very, very hidden. Okay, but right now we're talking about the earliest kind of life. So, okay, so in every plant's life cycle, there's going to be a gametophyte generation, it's called a generation, and a sporophyte generation. So remember that the plant that decides it wants to have a family, do plants do that? I'm not sure. Anyway, then it sends out a spore, a single cell big, and that spore that it sends out, if it lands in the right place, if it's a fern, it'll grow up into a little tiny heart-shaped weird thing. Part of that little heart-shaped thing will make sperm. Part of it will make eggs. And then when these two guys come together, they will make another fern plant. Right? Now, this generation that makes eggs and sperm is called the gametophyte generation. Why? Because eggs and sperm are gametes. This little generation makes gametes, so it's called gametophyte, right? So if I ask you on the quiz, what do gametophytes make? You're going to say they make gametes. Not a hard question, right? And then that makes this the sporophyte generation. And what do sporophytes make? Sporophytes make spores. That's how they got their name. So gametophytes make gametes, sporophytes make spores. Great. Now, when the spores grow up, what do they become? They become gametophytes. When the eggs and when the gametes come together, what do they become? They become sporophytes. So sporophyte generation makes spores. Spores turn into gametophyte generation. They make gametes. Gametes come and they make the sporophyte generation. Right? Now, one more thing. The sporophyte generation is diploid. 2N is the notation that in biology that says this is diploid. 2N means it has 2 copies of each chromosome. The spore and the gametophyte and the gametes, they're all one end. They're all haploid. So it's probably easier to remember that everyone's haploid except for the sporophyte generation. So there's one gametophyte and one sporophyte generation in each plant's life cycle. We're going to start by talking about the moss. The gametophyte is haploid, and gametophyte, it is plant-like. It is always multicellular. Okay? The gametophytes make gametes, and gametes are haploid, but they're one cell big. The sporophyte is diploid, 2N, and it is always multicellular. Yeah, good. Now, this is how mosses do it, right? So first of all, when you look at a moss, next time you're at the garden store or maybe out on a hike, moss always live in areas that are consistently moist. They may have periods of dryness like summer, but in general, they have to have consistent moisture. And that's because they are the most evolutionarily ancient. They're not a very complicated structure in some ways. But the moss life cycle, when you're looking at, oh, look at that moss. Oh, I'll run my hand along that moss. Kind of feels like a nice soft grass, right? What you are feeling with moss is the haploid gametophyte generation. That is unusual. All of the rest of the plants on planet Earth, it is the sporophyte that is dominant. because it is very useful to be diploid. If you are diploid, you get to pick 2 different copies of every gene. So if you get a bad gene, you've still got a good gene to go with. But if you are haploid, you just get to pick 1 copy of every gene, and if it's bad, oh, you're dead, okay? So it is unusual to have what is called a dominant gametophyte generation. So the mosses, the liverworts, and the hornworts are the only plants with a dominant gametophyte generation. Gonna be on the quiz. Gonna be on the quiz. And it's weird because they are haploid. They're 1N, they are haploid. You know, the rest of the plants, they figured out, hey, you know what? If we use our diploid generation, we can do cool things. And life took off in that direction. So when you are looking at moss, what you're looking at, all of this stuff down here, all of that, haploid. Oh, weird. Do you see this thing that kind of looks like a flower? Not a flower. This thing right here, that is the diploid part of this particular life cycle. So most of the time, what you're seeing is just this low mossy stuff here. And then at certain times of year, they will grow a sporophyte generation. What had to happen? So this stuff here, the stuff that is our fuzzy, soft green moss kind of stuff, that stuff at a certain time of year is going to either create gametes. So either eggs or sperm, and the sperm will have to swim over to the egg. Sperm, they've got to swim over to the egg. And that's one of the reasons why moss need to have droplets of water on them so that the sperm can swim over to where the egg is. When the sperm and the egg come together, they will create the diploid stage, which is the sporophyte stage. And this is what the sporophyte stage looks like for some moss. That's the sporophyte stage. It doesn't really do much in the way of photosynthesis. What is it going to do? It's going to make spores. So here we've got the spores, and the spores are going to just go out into the air or into droplets of water as the rain is around, land in other areas. If they land in an area where it's good to grow, they will grow up into a gametophyte generation themselves. And that's how moss will spread through their environment. They can only spread as far as their very, very delicate spores can move. Their spores are so fragile, they will dry out almost immediately. So really, they can only move about like being splashed by a droplet of water. All right, so there you go. So non-vascular plants, moss, this is what moss look like. Then we've got liverworts and hornworts. They are different. We will just talk about one interesting difference from the mosses. They do not have any vascularity. They're called non-vascular plants because they do not have tubes inside of them distributing liquids around inside of the plants. They also have no roots. They have no roots. If we had some in front of you and you dissected it, you would see things called rhizoids. Rhizoids are parts of the non-vascular plant that looks a little bit root-like. It's not considered a root because there are no tubes in it. It is still non-vascular, but it does attach the moss to the soil. So how does stuff get distributed around? Just by osmosis and diffusion. Yeah, and that is one of the reasons why the leaves, they're not called leaves, but the leaf-like structures of moss and liverworts and hornworts are incredibly thin so that there can be diffusion and osmosis right across the leaf layer. So the rain that falls here just gets sucked right into the plant. That doesn't happen with other plants. All right. So this is just another depiction of the bryophytes. Bryophytes are the mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. Bryophyte is another word for the non-vascular plants. Here's our gametophyte. It is haploid. Remember that these guys have a dominant gametophyte generation. So even though this is what you think of when you think of the moss plant, haploid. Yeah, it will either make sperm or eggs, and those guys come together and they will make this generation, this part right up there. Just that part that's depicted as tan there, that's the part that is the sporophyte generation. That's the part that is diploid. And those things will make spores. Spores are also, everything's haploid except for the sporophyte generation. These guys are entirely dependent on water. If they dry out, well, then they can't go on with their lives. They do have a dormant phase, but they need water constantly because they've got no cuticle, they've got no waxy surface to keep them from drying out. So you will only find them either in like rainforests where it's raining so frequently and in between rains it's really, really humid, or you will find them on like the north sides of houses where the sprinklers go off every day, or you will sometimes find them if there's a shady spot where the air conditioner drips, you can find mosses there because they've got to be kept constantly moist. And there are animals whose lives are spent living inside of these mossy habitats. Super cool. If we were meeting together in lab, you would find them as we were dissecting these guys, but sorry, you'll have to take my word for it. So this would be like moss, like up somewhere in Seattle in a cool part of the rainforest in our own American Northwest. Beautiful. And if we look at it here, all the green stuff is haploid. We only see that with the bryophytes, okay, where the dominant generation is haploid. And on this picture, this little guy right here that looks like a flower, not a flower, that's the sporophyte generation. Remember that for the lab final, I could show you a picture, okay? So, great. A little bit more about this. Yes, I have time. One other thing that some of the non-vascular plants can do, like the liverworts, is they can reproduce asexually by these things called gemmae. This is a leaf-like structure, haploid, and on the liverworts, there are these little cups. And here, if you zoom in really close, that is a gemma cup, likely to be on the quiz next week. So recognize it. That gemma cup is filled with these things that look like little green coins. Those are like little chunks, little tiny discs of liverwort life. They are genetically identical to this leaf-like structure. And why are they there? If a droplet of rain goes sploosh right there, it's going to sploosh all these little guys out, and they're going to land as far as the droplet can go. These little green coins are going to land. They're not green coins, they're called gemmae. And wherever they land, they can grow another liverwort. So liverworts have got a second way of reproducing that is asexual, just forming clones of themselves through the gemma cups. Make sure you can recognize them. We will start with the vascular seedless plants at the next video.